nightmare to others!
Today on the Restitutor Orbis channel, we explore the account of Jules Verne, the author who lived from 1828 to 1905. Jules Verne, the seemingly prophetic science fiction author, although his literary style was called Romanticism at the time, who was born in Nantes, France. A very interesting individual who lived during that questionable time frame of the 1800s. Why does Jules Verne warrant our attention? It would seem that Jules Verne was the visionary who contrived many of the ideas of wondrous technological advancements that would supposedly come out of the 1800s and then play a key role to this day in the 1900s and the so-called 21st century. Whatever year it actually is, we can certainly debate on that. But Jules Verne is interesting because we have few images of him due to the fact that he was born prior to the invention of the camera and the fact that his life seemed to have many different twists and turns to it. We're going to examine the background of Jules Verne's life and how he grew up in Nantes, France, and became the actual author that he is. He was also an accomplished poet and a playwright, as many people seem to be during that time. Although to give him credit, he didn't actually have avocations. His desire to be an author was his primary profession, which makes him quite unique in the annals of the 1800s. When we look at the background of Nantes, France, we see many wondrous examples of old world architecture. And of course, the mainstream explanation for this will be, well, this is France. This is part of Europe. They had hundreds of years to build all these wondrous structures. And of course, if you watch any modern movies that are set in France, you'll see no shortage of examples of old world architecture. Nantes, France is no exception to this. Being located only about 30 miles from the Atlantic, it's a wondrous and beautiful community to this very day. Of course, I'm sure there's somebody out there that'll disagree with that assessment, but looking at the images and having the fact that this is the city where the great Jules Verne hails from, and it should be noted that Jules Verne is very well known. Although, of course, Nantes, France has its unfortunate elements of history, as every other area in the world does, such as with the French Revolution. We can certainly see, though, that this would be a city that would inspire somebody such as Jules Verne with its impressive architecture and its very rich cultural background. It should be noted that Jules Verne's family wanted him to pursue the legal profession, especially his father. And indeed, this was a point of contention between Jules Verne and his father. His father wanted him to follow in the legal profession, and therefore sent him off to Paris to be educated in law. But Jules Verne persisted. He wanted to be an author, as he felt that was his primary calling. And when you look at some of the more specific examples in Nantes, France, you'll see that there's no shortage of incredible cathedrals, such as the eponymous Nantes Cathedral, where they're supposedly renovating it, and that explains why we have this color difference. Considering the account of this very cathedral in Nantes, they were allegedly building it for over 100 years. Yes, another one of these cathedrals that they built over 100 years, and yet managed to maintain consistency and continuity in the construction, and managed to lay it out with total geometric precision. Yes, once again, another example of tremendous and incredible architecture from a time frame that was shortly after the bubonic plague had hit Europe. And again, no less impressive than the other cathedrals that you have across France and across the land. And this supposedly has a bit of a Gothic styling to it. Of course, there does seem to be other elements to it. One could understand why Jules Verne, when he was walking around the town, would be inspired by such sights as this. Although we are considering the question, did Jules Verne really exist, or is he merely a compilation individual, another individual who may have released the wonders that we have from the previous civilization? Looking inside the cathedral, again, we see examples of great architecture and geometric precision within the wondrous pillars and columns, and indeed in the arches and the ceilings. We've seen this before, and we'll see this again in our explorations. Now, no one will build like this today. We'll try to replicate it, and we have our usual reason for why we don't do it. It's too expensive, it's too difficult. We don't have craftsmen and artisans on every corner who are just hanging out waiting for employment, and we don't have the logistics capacity that we did in the 1800s for reasons unknown. Of course, this cathedral would include a wondrous and amazing organ that could no doubt transmit incredible sounds. I'm always intrigued by the effect of sounds on the human psyche and the body, and it seems that the power of sound is something that we're oftentimes quick to dismiss. We see that once again there's no shortage of modular construction within this cathedral. And so, back to the early life of Jules Verne, we have this individual who was born, and yet you would expect the society would not be supportive of someone to develop a creative mind. But there's always the exception to every rule, and there's always a polymath or someone who's brilliant wherever you need them. And when Jules Verne was actually in Paris, there was an abdication going on of the French King Louis, one of the many kings named Louis, and this also supposedly jump-started the social revolutions in 1848 across the land that we explored during the Reset War of 1847-1848. Who knows exactly what was really going on? You can still visit the museum dedicated to Jules Verne in Nantes, France to this day. And naturally, it's another old world building that we're informed was built during the 1800s. Because what else would it be? It's situated on a hill and has nothing questionable about it whatsoever. Just a nice, very pretty tower and what we might even consider more generous gingerbread construction. Or perhaps a different pattern that you might want to let me know in the comments what you think it looks like. It has a tower and it's marked as the Jules Verne Museum, and you can visit it to this day and obtain a great appreciation for this wondrous visionary and prophet. Now, if Jules Verne did really exist and his life developed as we're told, then we have someone who managed wonderful creative achievements and was somehow able to predict the exact development of technology in the 1900s to today. Very impressive achievements, and of course Nantes includes a wondrous column, another column that's dedicated to another king named Louis. Believe me, there are no shortages of kings named Louis in France, just like there were no shortages of kings named Henry in England and France in the distant past. Some of these wondrous structures never cease to amaze me, though, with their size and eminence, and it's amazing trying to think of how the mainstream historical account justifies the construction of these very large and well-constructed buildings, some from the 1700s, and that's how they try to use the history within Europe to justify the construction, although there is also the justification of the industrial revolutions that were going on. And it should be noted that when Jules Verne lived, it was during the so-called Victorian era, when we have this other occurrence of asylums and workhouses and some of the darker sides of society. They also have a really nice arcade in Nantes, so if you're over in France, I can definitely recommend this as a wonderful old world destination to visit. And even if you don't exactly approve of these theories, it's still very pretty and there's many unique locations to see. One could understand why you'd have a great shopping experience seeing this kind of artistic and creative beauty all around you. But to this day, we have managed to establish modern skyscrapers across Europe, and it's also interesting when you go to Paris and you see how that movement has been established. But Jules Verne managed to persist in his desire to write creative novels, and that was his first calling in life, and we're going to take a close look at what he exactly wrote. It's intriguing to think of his development, though, with conflicting with his father, given his father's desire to pursue the legal profession. And how many other individuals do we have this story for when they're given a path in life and it's something that they're pushed for by their father? Typically they accede to what their father wants or their family wants. Nice theater. Again, never a shortage of theaters or opera houses with all of these wondrous details of the old world in them. And if the mainstream account is true, and if Jules Verne really was brought up in such a city, then perhaps these sites could explain how he was able to develop this creative imagination that he had in his works. This is Pierre-Jules Hetzel. This was Jules Verne's publisher and editor, and once Jules Verne met him, he was really a significant force in ensuring that his works were published. It should be noted, though, that officially Jules Verne's literary reputation has suffered, especially in the so-called English-speaking nations, at least that's what the official account says, because of the fact that many of his works were edited or abridged, and therefore many of the people, when they read Journey to the Center of the Earth, one of Jules Verne's most well-known works, they didn't read the full version of it. And so it's oftentimes attributed to just being a child's novel or something that's just the product of some wild Frenchman's imagination. And yet there is such a greater degree to Jules Verne's works, and if you decide to read his books and really indulge in his novels, I strongly suggest you read the unabridged editions. There's many interesting clues and hints and perceptions that we have in the novels that really match with the research that we do. Considering the fact, though, that these are attributed to simply be imaginatory or children's novels, funny that they even consider that when you consider how complicated they are and how deep they are in plot, you realize that Jules Verne either had some sort of template in his mind, or he must have been a creative visionary. He's also attributed across the land, for example, Jules Verne Park in Tampa, Florida. For some reason, Jules Verne is well featured in Tampa, Florida, and if anybody knows why, let me know in the comments. Yes, I know why. I would just like you to see why they concern themselves with Jules Verne in Florida. You'll get a couple hints further on in this exploration. There is even a monument to him in Spain in some of his works. So here we have an individual that was from France during the high time of nationalism who managed to surpass those bounds and be well known across the land. But who exactly did Jules Verne inspire? How did he inspire these people and why? Let's take a look at the works of Jules Verne in his books. It should be noted he was a contemporary of Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas of Three Musketeers fame. One of his earliest works was 5 Weeks in a Balloon, or Three Englishmen Go to Africa. And oddly enough, you see this theme with many of Verne's works where it involves some sort of unique form of transportation, especially for the 1800s. And indeed, this is where Verne supposedly established his reputation of being an explorer. And you can also see this theme in many of his novels where you have some advanced form of transportation, some unique technology, and Jules Verne is remembered as being sort of the father, if you will, of science fiction. We look at his next well-known novel, The Adventures of Captain Hatteras, which involve a journey to the North Pole. I can't imagine who that would have inspired in the future. And remember that this was written during the middle of the 1800s and the 1860s. And so you have these amazing adventures. And there's even an account of how when Jules Verne was a child, he listened to his teacher tell a story of someone who ended up like Robinson Crusoe. We also have a journey to the center of the earth, indeed one of the most enduring stories from Jules Verne that involves individuals exploring beneath the earth's surface. So here we have accounts of other lands, other means to access other lands using more advanced technology. Again, was this just the product of Jules Verne's imagination, or was there something else? We have From the Earth to the Moon, one of the first examples of a story of actually traveling to the moon. Although we're informed that Kepler actually had a story of this, and he used his mother's spells to reach the moon, at least according to Carl Sagan. But we don't need to be mentioning Carl Sagan with Jules Verne, at least not today. And perhaps the more widely known Around the World in 80 Days, again, using advanced forms of transportation to actually traverse the land. I like how they depict the world on a flat map, but of course you're watching this on a flat screen, so you're going to see it on a flat map, which fortunately works on a flat screen. I'm just noting that. And then perhaps Jules Verne's most well-known from the 20th century work, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And we have another advanced form of transportation in the form of a submarine. Some people attribute the idea of the submarine to Jules Verne, although it should be noted that there were many ideas considered for the design of the submarine, supposedly, in the mid-1800s. You might recall when we explored the USS Alligator from the United States Navy for its employment during the Civil War. Of course, it did not have the capabilities of the Nautilus that was featured in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but there were many of the same principles. And indeed, when you see some of the artwork of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, you can get an idea for the imagination in Jules Verne. And this is why I strongly recommend that you read many of his novels for yourself and get the idea of what he was truly alluding to. And then you even have one of his latter novels, The Lighthouse at the End of the World. And many ideas and great implements of technology that are featured in Jules Verne's work. But beyond that, he also features these interesting views of this struggle of humanity. Who did he inspire? Admiral Richard E. Byrd, no less, with that story of exploring the North Pole, The Adventures of Captain Hatteras. Yuri Gagarin, because if you're going to go to space, you may as well read Jules Verne's novels, or whatever space we're going to. Wernher von Braun, because he was inspired by Jules Verne as well. American rocket engineer Jack Parsons, and if you've never heard of him, I suggest you look him up. He's a very interesting individual. He has lots of interesting backgrounds, including his affiliation with Aleister Crowley. I'm not making this up. You should really read about Jack Parsons. And least we forget Dr. Emmett L. Brown, who was so inspired by Jules Verne, he invented a time machine out of a DeLorean and then named his children after Jules Verne. So let's take a look at Jules Verne's technology, or at least some of the implements of technology that were introduced to the wider population in Jules Verne's works. We have the submarine, and we talked about this concerning the Nautilus and its effects on future development. Indeed, the United States Navy's first nuclear submarine that did indeed go explore up in the polar regions, as we're told, was named the Nautilus, in honor of Jules Verne's Nautilus and Captain Nemo's Nautilus from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The intriguing thing, though, about Jules Verne is that he did inherently consider his characters, whether they were traveling under the sea, going to the moon, whatever the moon was really supposed to be within his stories. I mean, maybe it's the moon as we think of it in space. We don't really know. I certainly advise you to read the story and come to your own conclusions. There's also the inspiration that we seem to have from Verne's works, because he had an understanding of additional capabilities, a lot of these implements of technology, before they were in widestream use. Indeed, Jules Verne is also credited as the innovator of the steampunk genre, the Victorian, technologically advanced civilization. Did it really exist, or was it merely a product of his imagination? There is also the influences that Jules Verne has on science fiction. I mean, it's a little bit of a joke to talk about Dr. Brown and his DeLorean, but at the same time, it's also rooted in reality. The entire concept of a submarine. How advanced could a submarine be? There are some people that suggest that submarines are completely useless from a military standpoint, although from the official history we're told that the use of an undersea U-boat force by Germany during World War I and World War II nearly brought about victory, until greater technology was developed to counter the threat of the U-boat force. Strangely enough, there's many other interesting details within Verne's works where you can see visiting other lands, other civilizations, and other implements of technology. And this is why Jules Verne is considered the father of science fiction, because if you think on this, this is the very root of what science fiction is. But is this really science fiction? Or as John Colicos said when he was talking about Gene Roddenberry, is it actual science fact that's merely being introduced to the population as science fiction? These are interesting ideas when you step back and consider them. Now, whatever's really going on with our space program, it should be noted that there was even considered to be a ride for Jules Verne land and defunct land. And interesting, given Jules Verne's unique behind-the-scenes connections with Florida, that they consider doing this. And Jules Verne's association with airships. Now, what makes this all so interesting in this development of science fiction and these ideas of technological advancement? Where did they really come from? We're assured now that the development of the airship or the balloon was in the distant past. It was even before the 1800s. And yet, along with architecture, we have too many examples of too many things that were innovated, built, and constructed during the 1800s. And so it seems as though there's an overlap. There's a bit of an inconsistency. And so was this really just the product of the wild imagination of some random author in the 1800s who disobeyed his father's desires to become a lawyer? Or was there something more to this? Was this particular author referencing what he had known or somehow had knowledge of? Or was this merely a planned release of this knowledge, of these technological capabilities, to prepare a population for potential explorations of other lands that had been neglected, or the reintroduction of technology that was going to be used in a newer civilization? It almost seems as though it's a product of cycles, and if you step far enough back, you can get that impression. Again, this will be derided and will simply be stated that this was merely an individual who used their imagination, had an awareness of what was really going on in the 1800s, and could act in a prophetic manner, and therefore anticipate not only technological developments, but how technology was going to be applied in society. Perhaps you could argue it was because of his legal background that Jules Verne had studied, that he was able to anticipate exactly what technological advancements would be incorporated in society and exactly how they'd be incorporated. That's quite a prophetic nature that he has there, the ability to anticipate what's going on in the future. And yet that's actually one of the mainstream explanations for how he was able to anticipate all these things. Now let's look at some of Jules Verne's maps that he has in his works. Now, what's interesting about the maps? Well, we talked about several of the novels which indicate travel to very exotic locations, to include the North Pole, Under the World, and other such elements. Looking at some of these maps, though, we're told that they were inspired by other maps that we've looked at on this channel before. Maps which show areas that either were drawn by cartographers who didn't exactly know what they were doing, or they were employing their imagination a little bit too much, or they were going off of the ramblings of random explorers who didn't document things very well. Interestingly enough, though, author Umberto Eco has done a book considering this, called Legendary Lands, where he actually looks at many of these maps and how they either inspired human imagination or were inspired by human imagination. Recall that Umberto Eco wrote The Name of the Rose, and that he also believes that one of his family members was a foundling. Looking at the maps, though, we can see that even in this map of the North Pole, there's even the indication that there might be land up in that particular area. Of course, that is dismissed now to this day. We're told the only thing that's up there is ice, and indeed the many maps show that, along with nothing that's remotely questionable. And yes, my sarcasm meter's off the charts right now. But what really is up there? Well, apparently nothing very interesting. It's just ice, and you can take the guys from Top Gear up there and they can camp out, or you can surface a submarine through the ice. We recall the earlier Mercator map, though, that does show that there was land up there. And people will explain this, that Mercator simply didn't know what he was doing. He was going off the ramblings of explorers who didn't know what they were doing, and no one was going to possibly verify this. So use these as adequate charts of navigation, and suddenly you can explain why the Franklin expedition was lost for years in the 1850s. At least that's what we'll be told. Yet there's other depictions in maps of Verne's work which indicate a greater nature to the land, that there's other paths of access, that there's other lands that you can access, such as in Journey to the Center of the Earth. Indeed, this inspired many works all through the 20th century or the 1900s. And looking at some of the maps in terms of what's under the surface. What really is under the surface? Well, if you watch that wondrous film from the early 2000s, The Core, it'll show you exactly what's under the surface. And it's nothing particularly entertaining. I'm being facetious a little bit, but looking at some of these maps and considering that Jules Verne was one of the authors that actually explored what was under the land. I mean, is there anything under the land? Is it just dirt as far as the eye can see? Are there boreholes that go to different dimensions? Or is there something else entirely? Or is it a question we're just not supposed to ask and we're just supposed to accept the scientific explanation? There's a core down there, it generates the magnetic field, and if it gets knocked out of alignment or if there's issues with it, we may have to send an expedition down there to go restart the core. I mean, I know it's just a science fiction movie, just like this is just a science fiction story, but recall that there was once a time when they said that going to the moon was just a science fiction story and the product of wild imagination. But officially, we have been to the moon multiple times in the 1960s and the 1970s. We just can't do it now because we scrapped the technology. We had an order from the president at the time, we scrapped the technology, and even though we have more advanced computers now than we ever did, we're still trying to figure out how to do it. And you'll see the accounts of Florida and some of the interesting maps of Florida, as though Jules Verne had a special fascination with the particular area in some of his novels. And indeed, you consider the center point of Tampa. There's going to be an upcoming on-the-ground exploration of Tampa, and we're going to look at it from a fresh perspective, looking at some of the old-world constructions there. There's other maps of development that are interesting to look at within the perspective of Jules Verne's work. The development of technology, the exploration of the lands, and what's really the theme behind it. We look at these older maps and concern ourselves with how they may integrate into some of the maps that were replicated or reproduced or supposedly innovated from Verne's own works and his own explorations. No doubt this would inspire explorers such as Admiral Byrd to go seek things out in the polar expeditions, or Yuri Gagarin to go up into space and see what's really going on up there, because we have so many accounts of it. Or could this simply be referring to some other land that there's another means to access that we don't fully understand? Is that really what's being alluded to in these works? Well, you can easily dismiss this as just the product of science fiction until it's not. But we've seen many of these maps before, and we've seen many of these explorations where we have these interesting anomalies that tend to defy the traditional explanation that we're given. Why is it something applies in one situation, but it cannot apply in another situation, and yet the mainstream would tell us that it does apply in both situations? It seems to be something that comes up quite frequently. Indeed, if you read Around the World in 80 Days and actually look at some of the accounts, some of the people that are encountered and what lands they actually visit, you suddenly have a very different understanding of how the entire world may really look. Now, is that because that's how it really looks, or is that simply the method of Jules Verne's writing? Who knows for sure. There's even the interesting account of mysterious islands being found in unique locations. And we look at recent accounts of how islands just seem to have been suddenly discovered where no one knew there were islands before. There's a particular island that escaped Union prisoners in a Jules Verne story named Lincoln Island because Lincoln was just such an awesome president, and nobody debates that. But looking at these maps and these explorations and these colorful characters from these science fiction novels, or these children's stories as the English-speaking world regarded them, we seem to have a world that's laid out for us that's far more fantastic and far more amazing than we're led to believe. Now, is that really what it looked like? Or is there something else behind this story? Perhaps there's something more that Jules Verne was alluding to, or at least the powers that be were alluding to when they released these stories, this technology, and these accounts to us. Well, let's take a look at one final work of Jules Verne's, Master of the World. Someone was asking me on a comment about a film that concerned a great airship, and one of those films was 1961's Master of the World. Now, it should be noted the screenplay of Master of the World was done by Richard Matheson, and he combined two Jules Verne's works, Rober the Conqueror and Master of the World, into a film. The film stars Vincent Price as the character Rober, who is utilizing his airship, called the Albatross, to actually prevent civilization from having the capability to make war on itself. It's a very interesting film because it does show the employment of airships and what the technology can represent. Now, you can certainly say that Rober, the main character, who's portrayed by Vincent Price, and Vincent Price is always very entertaining to watch on screen, is merely a reflection of Captain Nemo. And while there are some similarities, there is a difference in how Rober goes about his implementation of removing the capability of society to commit war. It's also intriguing to consider that some of the cast includes Charles Bronson, so you get to see Charles Bronson go head-to-head with Vincent Price in this film. Now, the effects are very dated, but consider the time frame that this film was actually released, and also consider what this film was truly reflecting from the imagination of both Jules Verne and Richard Matheson. What were they really showing, and what were they really trying to say? The main star, of course, in addition to Vincent Price and Charles Bronson, happens to be the Albatross itself. Quite an imagination they had to depict an airship such as this, and this is one of the very centerpieces of what we consider to be the steampunk genre to this very day. And this is why Jules Verne is attributed as being the main innovator of steampunk, and also science fiction. But the film really considers the struggle of one civilization giving way to a new civilization. And why is it a new civilization is constantly at war with itself, especially in regional conflicts? And yet Rober is considered the conqueror. He's going to be master of the world with his airship, the Albatross. That gives him a military capability that exceeds the military capability of other nations. So is he really any different? It's up to Charles Bronson's character and the other cast to stop him in his dastardly deeds. Now, it may seem like it's a very simplistic film from the early 1960s, but there are some deeper themes and a lot more complexity in it. Indeed, as there is in the more well-known 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So it does look and give a modern incarnation of what was being written about in these so-called Victorian-era novels, and I can strongly recommend it as a film about an airship. And so let's consider the final question. Who exactly was Jules Verne? How did he actually have this capability to anticipate the technological developments that were going to headline the 1900s and the 1800s? And we look at our 5 eras theory, and we ponder the question. This individual who is from France, who was supposed to be a lawyer based on his family's profession, and yet he decided for himself that his profession was going to be writer. Now, it's a great story, and it's a great biography that is well documented, but if we look at this time frame, these reset years, and we look at the Victorian era or the 1800s as being set right during this time frame in which the reset between the 4th and the 5th era occur. We look at the release of all of these elements of technology, at least in terms of concepts and ideas, which did come about in the 1800s. Officially, the submarine was invented in the 1800s. It was tested and used in the United States Civil War. There's supposedly an earlier edition of the Turtle in the Revolutionary War, although make of that what you will. But then it goes beyond submarines. Jules Verne wrote extensively about the concept of airships. And indeed, when you look at the aspect of Master of the World and how it was reflected in the sightings of mysterious airships at that time frame towards the late 1800s, there's suddenly many more details in these stories and what Jules Verne was trying to share with the population at that time. Now, is it because he was really creative and was brilliant that he was able to anticipate how all these technological advancements were going to come about and be integrated into civilization? Or was this really part of a controlled release of information to prepare people for what the new civilization was going to be? Let me know in the comments. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
This isn't an ordinary fight. This is a fight between the powers of light and darkness.
Howard Phillips Lovecraft, and we look at his biography initially. Born 1890, died 1937. H.P. Lovecraft, pictured here with his parents Winfield and Sarah, who went by Susie. And even looking into the background of his parents and his location, we already have indicators that show that H.P. Lovecraft would become a very interesting individual. His father, Winfield, would not even get out of the 1890s, being committed to an institution in Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island, where H.P. was born, and his mother was subsequently committed as well. So, two parents who were institutionalized. And in this image here, you can see, very intriguing, that H.P. Lovecraft was dressed in a dress, and this was before he was breeched. This was apparently a custom from the 16th to the late 19th, early 20th century, where boys were not breeched or put into pants until they were age 2 to 8. It was a rite of passage. Here is the institution, Butler Hospital, in Providence, Rhode Island, where H.P. Lovecraft's father met his untimely demise. We believe that his mother met her untimely demise here as well, and that the records concerning what happened to his mother were lost in a fire. Yes, all this in the initial formative years of H.P. Lovecraft, with his parents being institutionalized. And apparently this played quite a traumatic role in the development of H.P. Lovecraft, as it would with anybody. Can you imagine being a child and seeing both of your parents taken away? Now granted, his father was while he was a child, his mother was once he was a teen and in his later years. And think on how this affected his development, and apparently this is where he had dreams of gaunt figures, and it seemed to develop his mind to where he could connect to having the ability to see other things in the world. What's really intriguing about Mr. Lovecraft, though, is that he never attended college. He developed his literary profession and many of his imaginatory stories on his own. He didn't need to go to Brown University. He reflected on the experiences of his life, and you could say he was one of the true autodidactics who managed to develop his literary craft on his own. Yet it was from the mind of this individual that the greatest tales of cosmic horror and monsters, many of which would develop to modern stories that most of us are quite familiar with, such as the development of the Alien story and the Alien movie franchise, which will always be remembered, especially at its height from the late 1970s to the mid-1980s. But back to Mr. Howard Phillips Lovecraft. He also had his maternal grandfather who influenced his development. The family was well off financially, and his maternal grandfather Whipple eventually lost many of the successes of his business enterprise, leading to the family experiencing more financial difficulty. And so it's, again, the early story of tragedy for young Howard as he was trying to make his way in the world. He initially seemed to be born into a family of wealth, and his father was institutionalized, and his maternal grandfather, responsible for the wealth of the family, also lost his business ventures and passed away. He would move on with his life, though, and would marry this interesting individual, Sonia Green, and she had her own literary influences. Although tragically, they didn't seem to get to spend much time together because her financial fortunes collapsed shortly after they were married. It seems to be a recurring theme with poor Howard. And yet it never stopped the development of his mind and never stopped him from continuing to write the great literary classics. Now, what can we really say about who he was, though, as an individual? That's where it becomes difficult, because we have to remember the only thing we have on Howard Phillips Lovecraft is what's written about him. But who was really the individual? that's something that we really have difficulty connecting with because we don't have first-hand accounts. And so there'll be no shortage of people who will claim that they know Howard Phillips Lovecraft and what he represented and what particular stances he had on politics and society based on his writings. And these may be true. They may reflect to a great degree of accuracy in terms of what his true views were. But we also have to recall that someone who is clearly this insightful and intelligent, one who developed their own intelligence as Howard Phillips Lovecraft did, would certainly be aware that what he wrote had to conform to certain elements of society. And when we look at his vast array of works, we'll gain an understanding of what he was really trying to say. And he seemed to be quite aware that there were certain things that you could say and certain things that you could not say. That was true then, and it's safe to say that it's quite true now. But it's really the vast array of works that H.P. Lovecraft composed that his legacy truly remains with us. Because, as we stated earlier, he influenced the development of modern horror in many ways. And there's no shortage of movies and franchises that look in the genre, such as the At the Mountains of Madness. And it's very intriguing to look at his original manuscripts and the writings that he did. Interestingly enough, he never managed to successfully support himself as a writer, despite the fact that he had an unlimited creative mind. And he died in relative poverty. And you look at the story of his life. He did not manage to make his marriage work with Sonia until the very end, and she actually ended up marrying another individual while still legally married to him. So many interesting accounts of tragedy. Yet we can see that it didn't stop H.P. Lovecraft from developing some of the most unique and insightful works on horror. And indeed, he would develop the genre that's called cosmic horror. And we'll look directly at all the different works of H.P. Lovecraft, exactly what they influenced, and how it may tie into our study of the 5 eras on this channel. One of the things that initially interested me, though, about the writings of Howard Phillips Lovecraft is that there seemed to be no limit in terms of things that he was willing to consider. He seemed to have some sort of awareness of a world or a land that's beyond our wildest imagination. Now, this could well have come from his mind, much as the same way that Hyboria, or the Hyborian Age, came from the mind of Robert Howard. And it's also interesting to note that H.P. Lovecraft connected with Robert Howard. When we look at the vast works of H.P. Lovecraft, we think of horrific monsters and entities beyond our very description. And this is the true legacy that H.P. Lovecraft left us. The theme, the entire genre considered cosmic horror. And you'll ask, what exactly is cosmic horror? One of the basic principles that Lovecraft apparently embraced and wrote about frequently was the aspect that humanity was not the primary life form within the land, or the universe, or however one could look at our entire existence. That's probably the most interesting element of H.P. Lovecraft's work, is that he was willing to consider other lands and other forms of existence. And as a result of this, an entirely different form of existence, horrific entities. And this is why we have all these terrifying tentacled monsters that dot the landscape of all of his works. He seemed to understand, though, that there was an entire existence, a pantheon of deities that existed in an entirely different realm. Deities that he called the Great Old Ones. Now, I'm not going to reference the very works of Lovecraft himself. I strongly suggest that you read them and make your own interpretations on what he was reading, what he was alluding to. And yet, it's without any doubt that what he really was writing about were some of the greatest horrors that we can begin to imagine. What was most terrifying about these entities was the fact that they weren't necessarily concerned with the existence of humanity. They seemed to even perceive humanity as no more significant than the way we might perceive ants. Unless, of course, you're someone who's interested in ants or you have an appreciation for all life forms. And what made this terrifying is that these entities had such a horrific and extreme existence to them, that their utter indifference to other life forms could lead to suffering. Indeed, one of the recurring themes of Lovecraft's work is the protagonist oftentimes inadvertently comes across these entities and suffers horrific consequences as a result. We can think of the fact that these entities might be referring to something that existed in the distant past, Or maybe they're from another reality, a parallel reality. And indeed, this is what Lovecraft suggests in his work, that they exist in a void that's beyond our existence. Or it's oftentimes reflected in the story that many of these deities, these creatures, these horrifying terrors exist deep underwater and are only contacted by characters in the story in water settings, such as the famed Cthulhu himself. Looking at the vast array of Lovecraft's work, though, you can see the many inspirations that he had. Sometimes he would write stories that concerned a particular protagonist finding a localized horror. They were always set in New England, Providence, Rhode Island being where Lovecraft was born and where he died, and therefore he sat his stories in these interesting locations. There's also the fact that his work did inspire no shortage of other authors and numerous other filmmakers through time, and all you have to do is a simple search for Lovecraft-inspired works, and you'll find no shortage of films and authors' works that managed to convey the existential terror and horror that was felt in H.P. Lovecraft's baseline works, such as the Alien franchise. And granted, while it was composed in the 1970s, the very creatures that are quite famous from it were inspired by Lovecraft. We should also consider the colossal size and the immense proportions that we have of many of these creatures, the great old ones. And whether you want to go along with Lovecraft's description of these being deities or simply terrifying entities that existed in the distant past, they seem to convey quite a horror. Indeed, he even wrote of deities that were at the very center of the cosmos, constantly devouring elements of it. I also suggest that if you're interested in Lovecraft's work, to look up the pantheon of gods or deities from this dark land, this void that he wrote about quite frequently. He seemed to have an understanding of these entities as being something from a distant earlier era. Perhaps that's how it ties into our research. But I suggest you research the background of each of these entities if you are interested in Lovecraft's work, because he seemed to have a very interesting and specific idea of what each of them represented, right down to the description of their terrifying physical forms and also their unique array of powers. And so what exactly was this? One of the examples, or one of the films that's been released more recently that seems to encompass the terror that Lovecraft was writing about with cosmic horror, was In the Mouth of Madness, or John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness. This is a film from the 1990s that starred Sam Neill, and it concerns an author who is writing stories that suddenly start to become real. Naturally, these stories are set in a New England setting, and it involves a protagonist, an insurance investigator, who has to go and investigate this strange disappearance of the author. But as he looks deeper into what's going on, he finds out that it appears that there's been a hole ripped in the very fabric of reality itself. And as a result of this hole, there's been cosmic entities, the great old ones, who've returned, and they wish to destroy humanity. Not because they have any malevolence towards humanity, but because they have a total indifference. And you can look at the works of Lovecraft, and you can also see that he plotted maps for lands, much as many of the other high fantasy and sword and sorcery authors did. And so, quite a vast array of work for someone who only lived to be 46 years old. But again, there's this creative element that's expressed in these works. Did this really come simply from the mind of Lovecraft? Or was this some sort of ability that he had to channel an understanding or awareness of these creatures, these entities? There's also the fact that his work represented his view that humanity was indeed insignificant. Although, did Lovecraft really believe that? Or was that just one of the narrative tones that he put in his writing? Or was that just his way of giving us a warning of what really could be out there? Things that we've encountered in the distant past. Indeed, if you recall the film Lawnmower Man, one of the lines that Job, the protagonist, transformed to antagonist as the story goes on, utters is that humanity once had great abilities to use larger portions of their mind, and as a result of losing it, he's managed to rediscover it through the use of virtual reality. Consider what we may have unlocked with our ability to expand our minds. somehow Lovecraft was able to channel views or awareness of these terrifying entities and what kind of realities they could represent for the very existence of humanity. And this is the very crux of the cosmic horror. It's the fact that humanity is insignificant, that there are these deities that exist in a void beyond our understanding, and oftentimes they have an awareness of what they want to do to the land that does not concern humanity. There's also the recurring theme in his stories of protagonists who come across these entities, these deities, and they have absolutely no concern for the fate of humanity. And oftentimes those that come across them meet with a horrific end. You might think of the most famous and well-known deity that Lovecraft writes about, and indeed his stories are named after, the Cthulhu mythos. Cthulhu being one of the most horrifying of the great old ones, and supposedly a mixture, a hybrid creature of a tentacled monster, a dragon, and a human. And oftentimes you'll see references made to Cthulhu. There's also the Mygo, terrifying spacefaring creatures that have no regard for humanity and will chop up human bodies to take their brains. And keep in mind, this is one of the more of the restrained stories, if you will, of some of the horrors that Lovecraft was writing about. Now, we could look at the development of his early life and understand that that may well have inspired a, how shall we say, negative view of existence. And there are accounts that Lovecraft struggled a lot when he was a child, that he had a bit of a nervous tic to him and he couldn't control his actions. He was never officially diagnosed with anything, at least nothing was ever written about it. But it's quite an interesting look at his background concerning the fact that both of his parents were institutionalized, and yet if you look at the few images that we have, they do not appear to be people who were suffering. They came from a very substantial financial background and had great means to support themselves. And yet the story of his life was constant immediate loss. The tragic loss of his father, the tragic loss of his mother, the tragic loss of his maternal grandfather, after watching his maternal grandfather's business enterprises fail, and then even his marriage. And while he had a great love for Sonia Green, they weren't able to be together because of their financial situation, and eventually she moved on with another while he was still alive. Imagine how this may have influenced a negative view. And yet there is a vast difference between having a negative view of life and being able to have an awareness and imagination to contrive all of these great and horrific deities that may have existed in a distant past or may still exist to this day in some other void that we can't begin to understand. And when you research and actually read the original works of H.P. Lovecraft, perhaps another theme that you'll find that's come up in more recent fictional writings concerns characters who find out things about themselves that they're not entirely aware. And you'll also find some other sorts of horrors, such as the lurking fear, where the protagonist finds out that an inbred family in a particular area in New England that's been completely isolated from society has devolved into monsters after hundreds of years of inbreeding. Now, we've only talked about a few examples of the stories of H.P. Lovecraft. 46 years that he lived, and it's also interesting to note that he did spend initial time as a literary critic in a way. He was even someone who allegedly embraced the superiority of the English civilization, as he believed with his upbringing in New England that England was the parent society of America. And apparently he had political views that favored the immediate American entry into World War I. Now, once again, these may simply be his writings conforming to the views of the time, and perhaps that's not really what he thought. Because someone who wrote stories about humanity being utterly insignificant, especially within the perception of these great deities, certainly wouldn't have concerned themselves with one particular portion of humanity being above another, because ultimately the themes of his works were that all humanity could be insignificant. Now, could this simply have been his negative connotation that he had with his life experiences? Or was this really his understanding that perhaps in the past humanity had not lived up to his potential? And perhaps he was understanding how terrifying that would be. But looking at some of his more recent works before he passed away, you can get a sense that he seemed to have an understanding of this vast world, this entirely different form of existence in his mind, what is called the Cthulhu mythos today, this existence of this pantheon of deities that exist in the void, these deities that don't concern themselves with the existence of humanity and yet also represent a grave threat to humanity. They could simply snap their fingers or employ their will and destroy humanity in a very short amount of time. Now, other fictional works that developed over the time in the 1900s certainly embraced these as the cosmic horror theme. But how does this reflect to our explorations? And why is H.P. Lovecraft perhaps one of the most interesting writers to read when you consider the fact that his works inspired countless works from many others, whether it was other authors or filmmakers? You can find a bit of a theme, though, in all these works, and it's most intriguing in the fact that what they were writing about, or what they were imagining, if you want to embrace that, seems to be connected in ways that we can't even begin to explain. The very cosmic horror of Cthulhu himself chasing you through the waters is something to be imagined and terrified. That there seems to be no way that if these deities are unleashed that humanity could ever resist them in any way, shape, or form. And so what are they really referring to? What do they really represent to us? Is there any way that these terrifying apparitions could have ever been encountered in the distant past? Is it possible that they do still exist in some sort of void or another reality that we're unable to reach to this day? These are perhaps the most disturbing implications of Lovecraft's work. And if you read any one of his original works, and perhaps some of his most well-known, The Color Out of Space, you'll find that the cosmic entities can threaten humanity very easily. You can find accounts of entities that are slowly devouring the land, existence, space, whatever you want to think of it as, one bit at a time, just as though they don't have a singular concern, and they're simply existing to destroy. There's also the many terrifying forms that are encountered in these stories by H.P. Lovecraft, creatures that seem to be spawn of these cosmic deities that have been with us since the very beginning of time, even. And there are more recent films that have been made about H.P. Lovecraft, although the films that I'll recommend to watch if you're new to Lovecraft include H.P. Lovecraft's The Necronomicon from the 1990s, where he's portrayed by Jeffrey Combs. It's an interesting series of 3 stories within the film that encompass some of the most terrifying elements of Lovecraft's work, talking about creatures that come from a distant past, or creatures that have decided simply to come back to the earth to devour humanity in a very direct method. There's also the fact that there seem to be different cults of humanity that worship these deities. Indeed, you'll find it a recurring theme of many of Lovecraft's works that some elements of humanity do see these deities as their true god. And this is yet another disturbing form of work from Lovecraft. And he does seem to be reflecting on events that have happened in the past. There's even more recent contemporary films that have Lovecraft elements in them, such as Cabin in the Woods, where we see the return of the Old Ones, referring to these deities that exist in a void, in which humanity is aware of them and feels that they have to make sacrifices to them. And perhaps it refers to one of the other troubling elements that we have of horror fiction, that it's always a work of nihilism, or it has no final meaning. Humans are simply there to be tortured and killed until the story ends, and oftentimes the story follows many familiar beats. And why would this be considered more terrifying? Because it seems that there is no way to resist these deities, and this is the very crux of cosmic horror, in the fact that humanity doesn't matter, and that these deities have existed since the dawn of time, and will continue to exist beyond the destruction of humanity. Indeed, if you watch the film In the Mouth of Madness, this is what happens. And so how is this connected with our explorations? Why is H.P. Lovecraft so interesting to us? Well, if we look at the existence of previous civilizations evidenced in more advanced structures across the land, we speculate, theorize that humanity had greater abilities, especially as we go in the distant past. And so one of the considerations I want you to think about involves concerning what humanity may have achieved. Was it possible that they had gone so far with their own spiritual development and technology and a civilization that they did actually manage to reach other realms, other realities, or perhaps even other forms of physical locations. Now, this is the great debate, because we still debate the shape of the land, we still debate the very nature of our reality, but we have many different clues that there's a lot more out there than we can even begin to conceive. And consider that with the 5 eras theory. People like to say they know exactly what these structures represent, and they may have some insight into them. But what does it really reflect with Lovecraft and the 5 eras theory? Let's examine it. And how do the works of H.P. Lovecraft fit in the 5 eras theory? Currently, I theorize that what he was really writing about, the great old ones, emanate from the first era. Now, why would I think this? We have to recall that as part of our theory, as you go further back in time, humanity had greater capacity and capability. And indeed, the other account of ages, whether it's from whatever culture, always indicate that we did have greater ability in the distant past. So imagine, what kind of entities, what kind of creatures would it have taken to actually bring down such a civilization? Or is it possible that this great civilization in the distant past, with perfect spiritual health, did manage to open portals to other realities? And in doing so, they enabled these cosmic entities, these terrifying deities, to actually access our land. This seems to be a recurring theme in the works of Lovecraft. Is it possible that somehow he was able to channel an awareness in his mind and write about how the great civilization of the First Era, which we used to call the Golden Age and is still called the Golden Age in the classical Greek representation of the 5 ages, was actually destroyed? Because this was humanity at its very height, the greatest achievements it could ever make. And whatever you believe with the concept of God or deities, if this was the time when humanity was also most connected with the positive deities, or perhaps the ones that were out to really see it benefit and develop over time. And yet somehow they lost their way, they became corrupted, whether it was through their own vanity or other means. It's a recurring theme, and certainly we have to consider the fact that every time civilization fell. And even off our 5 eras model, what really caused the resets? Why did these civilizations fall? But what are your thoughts? Did Lovecraft have some sort of insight, and that's really what these pantheon of old ones represent? And that they still exist to this very day, existing in a void that we can't even begin to imagine. Perhaps there are still gateways that they do have access points. And somehow, H.P. Lovecraft, through whatever experiences of his life, managed to come across this. And this is what he was truly writing about. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. The secret of steel always carried with it a mystery. You must learn its riddle, Conan. You must learn its discipline. If I die, I have to go before him, and he will ask me, "What is the riddle of steel?" If I don't know it, he will cast me out of Valhalla and laugh at me.
You were sleeping. You slept too long. We all have. It's time we woke. Time we stopped running.
Welcome to the Restituta Orbis channel, and today we're exploring Conan's old world, Hyperborea. The interesting aspect of sword and sorcery literature, and we're told that the Conan stories written by author Robert E. Howard was the father of sword and sorcery tales. How does it relate to high fantasy, though, and how does Robert E. Howard's world that he devised in the 1930s fit into our 5 eras timeline? Maybe it doesn't fit into our 5 eras timeline, but could it be an early portion of what we consider the 4th era or the Tartarian era? Or could it be that these stories took place during the 2nd or 3rd eras, and that they recount tales and stories and civilizations from those time frames? We're going to explore that today. We're also going to consider the fact that maybe these are all just fictional stories that someone who only lived for 30 years improvised from their wondrous creativity and imagination. We start by considering the account of Robert E. Howard, the author himself, and the Hyborian Age. Now, the Hyborian Age is what Robert E. Howard, the author, referred to as the time that his main character, Conan the Barbarian, lived in. The Hyborian Age is a contraction of the land Hyperborea, which was a legendary land that the Greeks had thought existed in the north, or what we think of as the Arctic Circle today. Oddly enough, these are the same Greeks that we attribute the foundation of civilization to, and yet we also say that they were superstitious fools who didn't exactly know the layout of their own land. Once again, another conflicted account, this time with what we consider to be the foundation of our current civilization, at least in the mainstream. Looking at the land that Howard improvised or innovated, if you go off of the mainstream account, you can see that there are many parallels with our current land, and yet it looks very different. We consider the fact that the nature of the land may have changed through reset after reset. But who exactly was Robert E. Howard, and what was unique about him as an author? Robert E. Howard was born and lived in Texas his entire life. He only lived for 30 years, 1906 to 1936, during a questionable time, the Roaring Twenties, and of course the Great Depression, which we've looked at many times. Robert E. Howard was a self-taught author. He was someone who taught himself the art of writing. And he had a very difficult life from what we understand. At least he was self-conflicted as an individual. Again, this is the mainstream account. We, oddly enough, know little about him as a person aside from what's written about him. And yet, in the 1930s, he was the one who innovated these fantasy tales, this sword and sorcery genre. Indeed, he's considered the father of sword and sorcery genre, even though he only lived to be 30 years old, and he only had one novel about the Conan stories. Predominantly, the Conan stories and the Hyborian essay that he wrote were simply to appear in many periodicals as short stories. The other interesting thing about Robert E. Howard is the fact that he only did live 30 years, and yet he had this creativity and imagination to innovate this entire world from his mind. He was also a correspondent with H.P. Lovecraft and seemed to share many of the aspects of other realms and the concept of portals and greater powers influencing the world or the land. Yet at the same time, he also disputed H.P. Lovecraft's view of civilization. Howard believed that civilization represented a threat to the individual, whereas Lovecraft was a proponent of civilization. Again, that's what the mainstream tells us. Who knows what the reality is? What was truly interesting, though, about Howard's stories at the time was that they touched on an entirely new genre that supposedly hadn't been revealed to the public before in fiction. Also recall that when most of these Conan stories were originally published as short stories, it was during the time of the Great Depression, and we're also told that Howard was afflicted by the Great Depression. In Howard's fictional narrative, he actually started with stories of Kull the King, which talked about the Thurian continent, or the Thurian Age. This was the time frame that preceded the Hyborian Age, and oddly enough, it refers to Thul, it refers to Atlantis, and Lemuria. Indeed, Howard seemed to recognize that these were civilizations during this particular age. And then there was a great cataclysm, and then this entire civilization was destroyed. And so you can already see that we have many of the allusions to the things that we explore in our five eras theory and looking at the old world. Now, once again, this could have just all been the fictional mindset of an inspired author in the 1930s in Texas. And you can look and see some of the examples from the Thurian Age, or the age of King Kull. King Kull himself was from Atlantis. And it's odd to consider that Howard was referring to a time when Atlantis existed. Indeed, he states that when the Hyborian Age occurred, it was between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, or what we consider to be the more quote-unquote modern civilizations, Sumer and Babylon. We'll also be exploring them here in the near future. It's intriguing, though, that what Howard's view of this point is that this particular series of civilizations had magic and had many other intricacies involved in its civilization. And recall that we're told that Howard considered civilization evil, although if you go off of mainstream history, one could understand why we would have that perception. Although we don't really know much about Howard directly. We know that the Thurian Age was succeeded by the Hyborian Age, and this was the age in which Conan the Barbarian, the eponymous character of Howard's most well-known stories, and the very well-known movie that was made in the early 1980s, launching the acting career of Arnold Schwarzenegger.
What makes Conan special, and what makes the Hyborian Age that Robert E. Howard wrote about unique? It improvised, in many ways, story elements that were told were not in existence at that time. It also incited the start of the sword and sorcery genre. Now you're probably asking, what's the difference between sword and sorcery and high fantasy, or what we think of with the Lord of the Rings series, which we explored in the works of Tolkien last year on this channel? Sword and sorcery allegedly just involve stories that are simply a single individual struggling in the same sort of environment that you tend to see in high fantasy, whereas high fantasy stories, primarily written by Tolkien, involve the entire fate of the world. At least that's the simple way to understand the differences between high fantasy and sword and sorcery, yet they involve many of the same elements. Of course, there's also the perception that sword and sorcery tends to reflect a much more violent and individualistic nature, which supposedly goes along with the values that Robert E. Howard embraced. The other interesting thing looking at Hyboria, though, is supposedly Howard was inspired by the existence of nations, and certain kingdoms within Hyboria, or the Hyborian Age that existed, Aquilonia and several others, are allegedly inspired by real-life kingdoms, or real-life city-states in Italy even, such as Aquilonia. However, in the film, we also see a wonderful depiction and an interpretation of what Howard may have imagined. We also have to remember that most of the works of Conan were written by other authors over time. Since Howard passed away, he committed suicide in 1936. We're told that he had a difficult life, and there are many different theories in terms of his internal struggles and conflicts. We just don't know exactly what was going on. It is rather interesting, though, that an individual who only lived to be 30 years managed to completely create this entire world, just with their creativity and imagination. Now, I'm not questioning if Howard did this. It's another interesting consideration, much in the same way as J.R.R. Tolkien, or even more contemporaneously, George R.R. Martin. These entire worlds that are created that give us a reflection of a very distant past time, and yet they show reset events. Consider the character of Conan himself. Conan represents the barbarian. It's in the title, Conan the Barbarian. He represents the ultimate individual from Howard's perception. The person who actually reflects qualities and values that are, according to Howard in the stories, superior to the individuals that live in civilizations. Yet, really, when it comes down to this superiority, it's not so much in one person being seen as better than the other. It's the fact that Conan embraces certain values that tend to be lost in civilizations. So perhaps Howard was simply given a warning in his character of Conan. You see no shortage of exotic creatures and elaborate accounts, such as snakes that are 80 feet long. And to this day, we have several accounts of alleged cryptid sightings of gigantic snakes in distant areas across the land. Maybe they exist, maybe they do not. Or maybe they existed in the past. Our mainstream says that giant snakes existed in the past. Of course, it's in the very distant past, as it always is. A lot of the landscapes and civilizations, and indeed the existential threat that was facing Hyperborea, was indeed reflected by the presence of snakes, or the worship of the snake god Set. And we'll discuss that when we look into the civilization of Stygia in Hyboria. Oddly enough, there is also numerous references to the power of a new form of religion and influence, which indeed was the worship of Set, which is very well reflected in the early 1980s movie, when we see not just the worship of snakes, but also the concept of embracing an identity of void. And indeed, the individual who is responsible for this, the character Thulsa Doom, embraces a twisted misanthropy in the film. We also see how Conan acquires his great sword, an Atlantean sword, when he falls into an old Atlantean tomb. And we see that the Atlantean king, or general, or whatever you want to think of him as, is a giant individual. Now again, this is just reflected in the story, but there's also a lot of symbolism. Indeed, what made the original Conan the Barbarian so successful as a film was that it relied a lot more on symbolism, on music, and on telling a story through visual elements instead of dialogue. Conan doesn't really speak a lot of dialogue, and indeed this happened to cater to the strengths of Arnold Schwarzenegger's ability to convey a physical performance. And not to denigrate Arnold Schwarzenegger's acting capability, but you're simply catering to an individual's strengths, and it's one of the reasons why the film worked so incredibly well. It also had a wondrous theme concerning the riddle of steel. What was the real search behind it? And the film doesn't tell you what the answer to the riddle of steel is, but it does display it very clearly in the entire plot. The other threats that Conan faces do tend to be the corruption of civilization, and that's depicted both in the original stories and in the way that it's depicted in the film. Now, there's numerous changes made to Howard's original characters, and of course, if you go to the city in Italy to this day that Aquilonia was inspired by, one of the kingdoms in Hyboria, you'll see that they have a nice collection of bells there. And that's just another little odd coincidence that we have when we consider the power of bells and what they could be representing in our many previous civilizations. There's also statements that Howard was inspired by individuals such as the Picts and other tribes that supposedly existed in history, but strangely enough, we have conflicting accounts about them as well, in terms of how civilized they were, how advanced they were, and it tends to create many different conflicting accounts. Officially, we're told that the reason Howard did not want to utilize actual history was it would have been too difficult to do the research to incorporate it into his stories at the time. Yet, he didn't have a Carnegie Library nearby in Texas, and of course we're well aware of many libraries at that time. We're also told that he innovated these great kingdoms and these lands in this time of Hyboria. But what would have been easier? Would it have been easier simply to go off of what was already written, or to innovate it? Or is it possible that he was actually consulting a different historical account, an alternate series of events? We even have accounts of apes that evolved into men that evolved further beyond that, and within a very compressed time period. A lot of people will find that there was a lot of controversy in Howard's works at the time, although the concept of controversy evaluating Howard's work seems to ebb and flow depending on the current state of events, which we can really say about anything. We certainly love to discuss how everything's controversial here in the 2000s. But you also see the other element of the Hyborian age with the constant conflicts and civilizations that are rising and falling, and that's something else that Howard tended to emphasize in his works, and indeed in some of the letters that we have in his exchanges with H.P. Lovecraft, he argued for the fact that there never really was one dominant civilization. Civilizations would rise, civilizations would fall. There was never really one that would ultimately hold the keys towards eternal existence. And yet Howard believed that the real strength, the real enduring quality of human beings was actually in the strength of the individual. And that explains a lot of his viewpoints and what we see in the stories. Now let's look at Stygia and Thulsadum. Stygia was considered a corrupted nation, a corrupted land that worshipped the snake god Set. There's a lot of interesting elements when you consider Stygia, especially given their entire culture and society. The high priests of Set within Stygia held all the influence. Now, supposedly Stygia was inspired by many different civilizations that are actually written about in history, and indeed we have no shortage of supposed honest historical accounts that talk about the primacy of sacrifice and how that would contribute to a civilization in the past. We certainly enjoy attributing that to the Aztecs, and it's one of the darker aspects of that civilization, if it did in fact occurred. Yet, oddly enough, when you step far enough back, you can find many examples of sacrifice, conducted in many different formats. Of course, the justification for sacrifice changes. In the past, we're told that sacrifice was done by a superstitious people, so it would preclude the natural events of the world overcoming them. And yet one of the darker elements of Stygia is the fact that they took sacrifice as an essential element of their society. There's no shortage of depictions, innovations, and creative artistic renderings that show how these sacrifices that were dedicated to the snake god of Set were conducted in Stygia. And indeed, the priests of Stygia and what they proposed for maintaining their civilization in balance with nature is a very alarming and disturbing story to look at. There is also the entire presence of snakes. Now, recall that earlier in explorations on this channel, we don't want to condemn simply the presence of snakes, but it comes down to how the symbolism is used and employed when we look at Stygia. It's also stepping back and looking at this kingdom, this civilization that supposedly came from the mind of Robert E. Howard, and yet there's some other disturbing elements that seem to bear some sort of realism in it. There's even the account of the snake god Set himself, or itself. The fact that it exists in multiple dimensions, that it can travel through portals, that it has all sorts of power. The power to deceive, the power to transform, the power to assume multiple forms, the power to create and destroy. We're even told that between the Thurian and the Hyborian age, or if you want to see as a reset being between those, Set was always one of the main individuals, the main deities that opposed the progress of humanity. And normally this was done in the stories through the advent of a corrupted civilization, which was represented by Stygia. In the 1982 film Conan the Barbarian, we see that the main character Thulsa Doom, who was also an antagonist from the original stories, albeit in a very different incarnation, embraced the concept of the worship of Set. And this is the commonality that you see. The character is wonderfully portrayed by James Earl Jones in the 1982 film. And his Thulsa Doom is of an ancient race that's been nearly extinct. The dialogue in the film makes it clear that Thulsa Doom is over 1,000 years old. And he's recruited several priests who have wondrous warrior capabilities, and here you see the High Priest Rexer on the right, and his assistant Thorgrim. These are the individuals in the film that carry out the will of Thulsa Doom. And indeed we see Rexor pictured here, who is no doubt Thulsa Doom's chosen successor. They recruit a group of followers, which quickly grows into the thousands and tens of thousands, and the dialogue in the film makes it clear that Thulsa Doom's snake cult is spreading across the entire world. Every single city has built a tower dedicated to the worship of Set. The people seem to be aware that this is an evil, terrifying threat, and yet no one really seems to have the will to do much of anything about it. Aside from King Osric, whose daughter is recruited by Thulsa Doom to be at his side. And indeed, the main plot element involves King Osric recruiting Conan, Valeria, and Subutai, his companions, to rescue his daughter from the clutches of Thulsa Doom. Thulsa Doom is portrayed wonderfully by James Earl Jones in the fact that he has an understanding of what the Riddle of Steel is really about. He also has tremendous charisma and influence over his followers. The fact that Thulsa Doom can speak with a voice and character inflections such as James Earl Jones, you can see that there's a lot of sense to many of the things that he's stating. When he talks about some of the unfortunate traits of individuals to be easily corrupted. He also shows and displays the power of influence that he has over his followers, when he asks one of his followers to simply come to him and jump off a cliff to her very untimely demise. And one of the points that he makes is the fact that he has this kind of influence, that this is true power. And many people simply give up their own will, or don't practice their own will, and succumb to the nature of Thulsa Doom. And here you see a very adequate depiction of what was represented by Stygia and this worship of the cult of Set. There is even the fact that Thulsa Doom himself can transform into a large snake, and it's depicted quite directly in the film, where we see Thulsa Doom transform into a snake, and it gives us a showcase of his magical capability, and indeed the unique aspects of the species that he was originally a member of. I like the fact, though, that the film gives you clues about it. It shows you his capability, but it doesn't have to explain the origin in detail, because oftentimes we do have mystery in life. And it doesn't affect the plot of the film, and it doesn't affect what's displayed with solving the Riddle of Steel, but it does give you some clues in terms of how powerful and charismatic certain individuals can be. And we all have to decide if a charismatic individual is really acting on our behalf or not. And you can see here the original depiction of Thulsa Doom as Robert E. Howard allegedly innovated the character. I don't believe that it betrays the actual vision, though, of Robert E. Howard, as the film did combine many of the elements that he had in his original stories, and it did represent many of the themes that he wanted to convey. Indeed, we have to consider the Riddle of Steel to understand the fundamental values. And what is the answer to the Riddle of Steel? Shall I tell you? It's the least I can do. Throughout the film, it begins with a monologue between Conan and his father. And that was one of the quotes at the start of this exploration, where Conan's father explains that he has to solve the Riddle of Steel. And indeed, the entire film revolves around events of Conan's life. A lot of people think that the original Conan the Barbarian is simply a revenge story. Conan's going to seek Thulsa Doom because Thulsa Doom raided Conan's village to kill Conan's people, his mother, his father, and then steal his father's sword because, as Thulsa Doom said later, he believed that weapons of steel were the key to success. And indeed, we see the terrifying scene where Conan has to witness the slaughter of his mother and his father right in front of his eyes. That's the opening event of his life that occurs shortly after his father tells him about the riddle of steel. So, the entire film is about the events of Conan's life. And really it's about Conan going through events and experiencing things and trying to solve the riddle of steel. And as he relays to Subutai, his companion who's a thief later in the film once he grows up, he says that he has to solve the riddle of steel. But what is the answer to the riddle of steel? Many people have said that it's simply an expression of will. It's that simple. And indeed, we see Conan's will tested when he's captured after his village is destroyed, and he's chained to the wheel of pain, which he pushes for years. We're given the impression that the other survivors from the raid died over time, but only Conan survived, and he achieved a body of great strength and capability just by surviving and pushing the wheel. Conan is recruited to be a pit fighter, and he is involved in many pit fights in which he has no choice but to kill his opponent every time. And so we see that the initial events of Conan's life have been tragedy. He's forced into situations of terrifying violence, witnessing the death of his parents, and then having to kill himself in order to survive. However, as a result of his victories, he's given an education, and he's brought to a higher status. Indeed, he's able to develop himself as an individual, even with the constraints of his particular situation. And soon he earns his freedom, freed by the very individual who had employed him in pit fighting, and he goes off on his own to seek vengeance against Thulsa Doom. Eventually he finds Thulsa Doom, the individual who led the raid of his village, who tells him that flesh is stronger than steel, that he will tell him the answer to the riddle of steel. And indeed, that's exactly how Thulsa Doom depicts it, that flesh is stronger. And he makes a very direct allusion to where the real power is, what is steel compared to the hand that wields it, and shows Conan that his influence and power over his followers is infinitely more powerful than the material of steel. He has Conan crucified, and Conan nearly dies until he's rescued by his companions. And it's at this point that Conan begins to reflect inwardly. He's learned through his life and his experiences, and he understands that what he really has to achieve is self-awareness. And when we see the kata after Conan survives his crucifixion, we understand that he's achieved self-awareness. In his final battle against Rexor, Thulsa Doom's high priest, Conan frees himself by breaking his father's sword in combat. This is symbolic. It represents Conan breaking the chains of his past and achieving his self-awareness, and ultimately his self-agency. While he's broken his father's sword, he still shows tribute to his past. He still understands his connections. But now he's no longer bound by it. He has the ability to impose his own purpose, his own values in life. And it's represented during the time when he wins this duel and wins back his father's sword, which he uses to confront Thulsa Doom and ultimately kill Thulsa Doom. Now, it may seem like it's a vengeance story, but behind it, under the surface, we see that Conan has sorted out the riddle of steel. And the answer to the riddle of steel is that self-agency is what everything is about. Achieving self-awareness through your experiences, that gives you the ability to impose will. That is the answer to the riddle of steel. So what era was the Hyborian Age and the Thurian Age, or whatever you want to call these time frames? Remember that the Thurian Age came first. Did it actually happen in the Second Era, and that's when we had the Thurian Age? Or did the Thurian Age come in the Third Era? We could see that in any point where we want to see Atlantis and Lemuria actually happening. There's indications for both. Or what about Hyboria? Did the Hyborian Age occur in the Third Era, or did it occur in the Fourth Era? Or is it possible that these were all just from the imagination of Robert E. Howard, and that this is all just a fiction? I do consider that possibility. There's also another perception that perhaps both these ages occurred in a single area, the Thurian Age and the Hyborian Age in the Second or the Third Era. Because remember, we don't exactly have a hard and fast line defining between resets. Or maybe they occurred in the Fourth Era, at the start before the Tartarian civilization. It's an interesting look to see how different people have viewed the past.
And it is possible that Robert E. Howard may have had some access, or may simply be another, how shall we say, placeholder individual that released a lot of this information, some sort of disclosure. It could also be possible that this is also similar to what we see released through the works of George R.R. Martin and J.R.R. Tolkien. We just don't know. And yet, when we see these allusions to past and previous civilizations, we realize that there could be much more to this in terms of fact and in terms of historiosity. It is rather strange that Robert E. Howard managed to compose an entire Hyborian essay in which he outlined this entire world that he supposedly just envisioned in his mind. Now, I don't want to discredit a single individual's creativity and imagination, but remember that Robert E. Howard lived a very difficult life, and he only lived for 30 years. And yet he was able to innovate something, an entire world all of his own, which other authors and other creators were able to run with for decades, and even continuing to this day. So what do you think? Is it possible that this Hyborian age really occurred in history, or is it all just from the imagination of one individual? Well, let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Channel members, and I wanted to go back and cover the film Things to Come, H.G. Wells' angry response to Metropolis. You might recall that this channel reviewed Metropolis over a year ago, and came to the conclusion that the main theme in it was, yes, we can have technological advancement, but if we don't have humanity, and a balance between humanity concerning balancing our emotions and our logical impulses, then we wouldn't be able to effectively wield technology. Well, H.G. Wells was not a proponent of that, and in fact the film quite frankly pissed him off. So he convinced the studios in the United Kingdom to release Things to Come, which you can see he wrote the screenplay to. Now, oddly enough, H.G. Wells was given an unprecedented degree of creative control over a film that he was the screenwriter of. Indeed, it stated that he acted as director, producer, and had unmatched influence over the film as just simply a screenwriter. It was his passion project, and as I said, it was his response to Metropolis. And the main theme of this film that he wanted to convey is that war is bad, but technology is good. And that's really the themes of the film in a nutshell. However, there's many different interesting plot elements within the film, and there's also some very intriguing dialogue that we can look at. Now, to summarize the plot of the film, there's a great war that breaks out in 1940. Yes, exactly when the United Kingdom found itself being bombed in the Blitz, and really when the war got hot again after the war officially started when Germany invaded Poland. So, oddly enough, it seems to be predicting what's going to happen in history, because remember, this film was released in 1936, and it's set in the fictional location of Everytown, but really Everytown you'll find the landmarks that match London. If you go and watch the film, and you can watch the film for free on YouTube, just look up Things to Come, 1936, you'll see and pay a lot of attention to the architecture. They do a very good job of replicating some old world architecture. Well, they get involved in this war, and in summary, the war wears down the nations of the earth, and eventually the governments collapse after fighting for over 30 years. And as a result, there's this wandering sickness that's afflicted the entire population. And the new governments are run by warlords. And in response to this, there is this new, incredible international movement that consists of engineers and mechanics, no, I'm not making this up, who have gathered in Iraq. Again, I'm not making this up. And they have decided to reimpose civilization on the world that was crushed. It's interesting to consider that they displayed and showed this collapse of society without the advent of nuclear weapons. Indeed, the main weapon of terror is aerial gas that's dropped on the population. That was the terror weapon of the 1930s. And it's what creates this wandering sickness, which in the film's timeline in the 1960s leads to the final collapse of the governments and society and civilization, and the rise of these warlords. And then this wondrous international movement that just somehow manages to gather all the engineers and mechanics in Iraq, and then they begin to reimpose order. And then the rest of the plot of the film is then, once they decide to reimpose order, how the new civilization is going to handle all this technological progress. And there's some people in the new civilization that are resistant, so it jumps forward to the 21st century, or the 2000s, 2040s, where they're going to send a mission to the moon. And that's the plot overall.
We see it from the perspective of Everytown, which is initially a surface city, because once this new order is imposed, and yes, they use that exact line in the film, all the cities are relocated underground in this wonderful dystopian utopia that H.G. Wells imagined in his mind. The main character of the film is John Cabal. John Cabell, they say, but it's spelled Cabal. And once again, I am not making that up, and I am not being sarcastic. That's the name of the character. John Cabal initially starts the film as a Royal Air Force pilot who serves quite honorably in this new war that's broken out. And then we don't really see exactly what happens. Somehow, despite fighting in the war in the early 1940s, he ends up in 1970 as a recruited member of this Wings Over the World, this new magical international organization that just suddenly assembles itself and begins to reimpose order. And since John Cabal initially grew up in Everytown, he returns quite triumphantly in a really nifty black uniform, and he's got a really cool helmet that he wears too with it, a very sinister looking helmet. Now, make of his black uniform what you will, but this is the uniform that Wings Over the World wears. This is the new international organization that's going to save the world from all of its warring. And of course, he sanctimoniously chastises the warlord who's in control of Everytown now, an individual called the Boss, or the Chief. And really, the actor who portrays the Chief is really doing a pretty good Mussolini impersonation. And even though he's supposed to be the ostensible straw man bad guy, oddly enough, he makes some very legitimate points when John Cabal shows up to tell him that you're going to surrender your nation to Wings Over the World. And he even makes this interesting speech before he talks to the chief, where he's talking to his old acquaintance, where he says, "We are the masters of efficiency. We have the free masonry of science." Yes, that's an actual line that John Cabal, in his black uniform, says in this film. I am not making any of this up. I mean, really, it has to be heard to be believed. And remember that this film was written by H.G. Wells, the famed science fiction author who gave us War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. Yes, it seems as though he had a very different perception of events in the 1930s. I can't imagine why. And here you can see John Cabal walking amongst the city, which is easily subdued when Wings Over the World shows up in their modern airplanes, their superior technology, and they dispense their gas of peace, as they call it. It knocks out the entire population. Everybody's okay, of course, except for the chief. The chief has an allergic reaction, and he dies. And Cabal just says, "Good riddance." Pretty much that's exactly what he says. Of course, we don't have any more collateral damage. Imagine if, half the population had an allergic reaction to this gas of peace. And as these really wondrous individuals, Wings Over the World, are going around the bodies in their black uniforms, as you see John Cabal doing here, and imagine if they told him, "Well, it looks like half the population's dead," and Cabal would say, "Good riddance." The other thing that the film really doesn't address is once these warlords and these independent city-states are subdued, what exactly happens with the population? Are they simply reintegrated into this new utopian society? Or are they killed? Or are they forced into labor? It doesn't even address it at all. Really, it just glosses over it, and the next thing we see is all these magical machines building these wondrous underground advanced cities. And then we're in the 21st century. And I'll give the film credit because it has some interesting visualizations and some concepts, especially when you consider the fact that it's made in the mid-1930s. The fact that they replicated the old world buildings, and yet, oddly enough, you don't really see technology as a savior in this film. You almost see it as a specter. Indeed, when John Cabal is chastising the chief when he's talking to him, the chief tries to tell him we're an independent sovereign nation. And John Cabal says, "Wings Over the World doesn't accept independent sovereign nations. So, guess what? We have better technology, and we'll use force, and you are going to see things our way." So, if you step back far enough, is there really any difference between Wings Over the World and these nation states that were fighting over each other? Oddly enough, a lot of the dialogue that you hear John Cabal make, and he even makes this wondrous speech that sounds kind of familiar to certain speeches that we supposedly hear at certain rallies, but I'll stop with the connections there. So when we jump to the 2000s, we have John Cabal's grandson, who is now, of course, the leader of this society, and of course he's wearing white, much in the same way that Archangel wore white in Airwolf. And of course, you might remember what Stringfellow Hawk thought of Archangel in his white outfit. I kind of feel the same way about John Cabal's grandson here. Of course, it's portrayed by the same actor, who somehow manages to convey a lot of very sinister looks and, oddly enough, suspicious statements. So in the future, they're planning to fire a projectile to the moon, because that's how H.G. Wells saw humanity traveling to the moon at that particular time frame. There are some interesting sets, and it is an interesting visualization of the future. A couple of the notes about the film I'd like to comment on is I think there was a lot of inspiration for future apocalyptic films, or even some of the war terror films. I mentioned earlier that the film did not allude to nuclear weapons at all. And even though there were supposedly nuclear weapons in development and the concept of nuclear power was being explored in the mid-1930s, the film uses gas as the terror weapon. And you do see civilization get grinded down into dust by fighting for all these years. You see the uniforms deteriorate on the soldiers as they keep fighting for decades, and you actually see the entire society break down. It's almost alarming in a way. But I ask you to step back and look at this whole pattern where this wings over the world, this magical society, this magical organization, this international armed force that only does good, or so we're told, it just forms and suddenly it's equipped and capable of inflicting all sorts of terror. Well, excuse me, it's not terror. They are going to bring humanity into a new age. And anyone who resists, they are going to be overpowered. One of the reasons I show this image from the film All Quiet on the Western Front, this is the 1970s version of it with Ernest Borgnine and John Boy from the Waltons, is I'm beginning to wonder, imagine when it is 2040, if you showed someone a photo like this, would someone think that this was a convincing photo from World War I? Would someone actually believe that this photo is actually showing German soldiers from World War I? Even though you know that Ernest Borgnine and Richard Thomas are most certainly not German soldiers. But if people see pictures, if they see stills from films in the future, what are they going to think? And the reason I'm posing that question is, you might recall when we did the Metropolis review, we still openly question if Metropolis is even a film that's even from our civilization. It may well be. It may well be Fritz Lang's brainchild, and just as we're told that it is. But recall that the 1920s and the 1930s already are a questionable time. Now, it's not to say that they didn't happen. I'm not questioning that. And it's not to say certain aspects of the history didn't happen. But we have to ask exactly how accurate was it. Oddly enough, there was a very, very cheap remake called The Shape of Things to Come that came out in the 1970s and even used some repurposed models from Star Trek, quite interestingly enough. So it was as though no one could really let go of this idea that H.G. Wells had, that technology was basically, I don't want to say a religion, but it was always a force for good. Technology could never be misused. And ironically enough, we know how technology was used in World War II, regardless of the truth and honesty behind that particular conflict. You go back and you take a look at the character of John Cabal in his uniform, and he's wearing a helmet that would put Darth Vader, well, heck, this helmet would put Dark Helmet to shame. And of course, this is how he makes his triumphant reintroduction into the movie in this time frame where we don't see him for 20-odd years, because we see him fighting in this World War II. They didn't call it World War II, but this conflict in the 1940s. And then he shows up again in 1970, and he's an older man, but for some reason, despite not being an engineer or a mechanic, at least we're not told that he is, all we know is that he's an RAF pilot at the start of this war, he's been recruited. And not only has he been recruited, he appears to be the leader, because he's the one who gives this great speech to Wings Over the World as they start their wondrous mission to unify the world by utterly crushing any resistance, any of the sovereign states, or perhaps another term you may have heard before, enclaves, any of the remnants of the previous civilization, which are effectively subjugated. Now, of course, the film makes it seem as though it's very peaceful. They even call it the gas of peace. It just knocks people out. And the only person who dies is the evil boss or chief who's really driving everything, because he wants to continue war with the hill people. Yes, that's exactly what they say in the film. A lot of the dialogue, when you step back and you listen to it with the mindset that we have now, is very alarming. And here we see the chief, and the way the actor portrayed him is he's supposed to be a caricature, namely of Mussolini at the time. Now, they were certainly well aware of the guy with the mustache in Germany, but at that time, Mussolini was considered the more threatening, oddly enough, in the 1930s, because Italy was actually undertaking operations at that time. Although, conversely, it was also under Mussolini's rule that the Lateran Treaty was actually passed, and the Vatican was restored with the Holy See. You might recall that, according to our official history in the 1800s, the Vatican and the papacy didn't really have any land or any official sovereign status, but Mussolini, of all people, was nice enough to give them back their status and sign the treaty. It's very intriguing when you step back and you look at it. But back to the film, it is supposed to be a utopian future. And we're supposed to see exactly how this utopian future has. And the main theme is that technology is always wonderful, unless, of course, governments or people misuse it. And once it's no longer misused, it will solve all our problems. Now, of course, we'll completely overlook the fact that IBM machines, atomic weapons, whatever you think the status of atomic weapons is, or whether they exist or not, just the fact that they're talked about, that still gives them enough reality for a lot of people. You don't ever actually have to see a nuclear weapon detonate to be afraid of one, right? Now, you could argue, well, maybe it's just taking John Cabal's philosophy here to a whole new level. We don't actually need to use the weapons, we just need to terrify people. And oddly enough, there are some elements of that post-apocalyptic terrorization that's employed in this film. And it seems to have been the predecessor to a lot of the nuclear scare, fear flicks that would follow, namely in the 60s with the War Game. That was considered the first one. But then in the 1980s, after the so-called detente of the 1970s ended, they went back to it. Now, back to the film, Things to Come, when we're in the 2000s, it's a utopian society. There is no sickness, they all live underground. Again, I'm not making that up. And their main focus is to send people to the moon. And they're only going to send perfect people to the moon, and of course they screen the population and find the perfect people. But there are some individuals in the society who feel that they're moving too fast. And of course the film makes it very clear that these people are wrong. And Cabal's grandson himself says, "You can never move too fast. We can go wherever we want to, whenever we need to." And that's really how the film ends. Oddly enough, when you look at actual footage of World War II, and then you look at some of the footage in the film, it's kind of eerie in some ways how they seem to get a lot of things right with what they were predicting, quote unquote. And even the dialogue is alarming in many different ways. Perhaps even more ironic, though, is if we consider H.G. Wells' push to show that technology is always good. When you consider the film The Time Machine that was released in the early 2000s, oddly enough, one of the main themes in that movie, and even the main character, Guy Pearce, says as Professor Hartigan, "We went too far." Oh, yeah, and the 1970s remake, I still find it comical that they pulled together some different models from Star Trek, but what's that have to do with it? Sometimes it's just interesting to me how everything within science fiction seems to be interwoven together in some ways. So what's my assessment of this film, Things to Come? You could look at it a couple different ways. You could really just look at it as the vanity project of H.G. Wells, and he was just trying to say that technology would always be good, and he did not like the film Metropolis. Indeed, Metropolis pissed him off to no end. Or you could step back even further and see that really what this film was a template. It really was looking at the shape of things to come. That you would have somebody like John Cabal here, yeah, they say Cabal in the film, but I'm saying Cabal because it's spelled that way, who has this wondrous plan and this international organization that's going to impose its will on the world. And that's exactly what happens. We do not accept sovereign nation states. He says it right to the chief. You're all just warlords, you're thugs, you're brigands. It's all the dialogue in there. And he justifies that they have greater force and they'll simply overcome them. So apparently the lesson to be taken from the film is that whoever has the best weapons and the best technology will rule the world. Although, oddly enough, that never did happen according to official history, at least the official history that we have view of. Although, is that really what happened? Or did things to come really take place? Is there an actual organization that is led by an individual such as John Cabal, or a group of individuals who really did impose their template, if you will, upon the entire land? Or was it already in existence and Things to Come was really just more of a historical film, looking at events that had already come, and that they were going to impose this technology on us? Indeed, we're to look at the chief, the boss, as a fool, a blowhard, a brigand, someone who was only looking out for his own self-interest, and therefore someone who needed to be destroyed or defeated. But again, of course, they gloss over the fact that nobody else had allergic reactions and died from this peace gas, and we don't know exactly what happened to the populations that they subdued from these remaining nation-states after the war. Did they enslave them? What if they resisted? What if they didn't want to go along with the wings of the world? We really don't know. They just completely gloss over it. Does any of this sound familiar? Does any of this seem a little disturbing with a lot of the things that we come across in our explorations? I'll compliment the film not just on its architecture and the way they seem to replicate London in every town, but also some of the battle scenes are quite intriguing. Because recall that this is before World War II, but they seem to understand that World War II was going to involve airplanes, it was going to involve armored warfare, the use of tanks, which is featured in the scenes, and they kind of look over the naval aspect of it all. But it's interesting when John Cabal returns to Everytown and he says, "We have control over what's left of the sea and the land, but namely the air. We have the best airplanes because the engineers and the mechanics who are going to impose the Freemasonry of science, we will bring about our utopian civilization." And that's really what this film is a depiction of. That's the plot in summary. So what are your thoughts on it? I'm rather curious, and by all means, if you're looking for something to do, watch the film. I strongly encourage it, because compare and contrast it with Metropolis. And remember that this is in a somewhat vague and ambivalent time frame, especially since we're told that there were interesting things going on, that there were still architectural achievements that we can't match to this day, namely with the Art Deco buildings. But what's really the truth behind this? Well, let me know what you think in the comments, and thank you for joining me. Megaliths, large stones that form parts of prehistoric monuments. That's the official archaeological definition for these incredible structures that are across the land. And as we gaze upon the most well-known megalithic structure in the United Kingdom, Stonehenge, we're going to be exploring even more dramatic examples of megaliths. Are these really what we're told that they are? That these are simple stones that were cut, crafted, and moved using the available means at the time to form some sort of monument, yet another temple or tomb? Or is there another account behind these incredible structures? Come join me as we examine these in detail and figure out the truth behind megaliths.
This isn't an ordinary fight. This is a fight between the powers of light and darkness.
Megaliths are a very contentious topic, especially between the mainstream and alternative research, and the main reason for this is the variety of explanations that are offered for, first, how they were constructed, but more importantly, how they were originally cut and moved into location. Stonehenge is the most well-known of the megalithic structures across the land. And we'll talk about Stonehenge first, and I'm sure one of the questions you're going to be asking is, will you be covering Göbekli Tepe, or the one that was recently discovered in Turkey? Not in this exploration. We are going to be talking about it in a subsequent exploration since it was discovered in the 1990s, something that is supposedly the oldest megalithic structure in the land. We begin by looking at Stonehenge, and Stonehenge may not seem to be the most dramatic of megalithic constructions, although it should be noted that there are many conflicting accounts with Stonehenge. We have indications or documentation that it did exist in the start of the 1900s and that it has been with us for the entirety of recorded history, unlike the aforementioned Göbekli Tepe that was only recently discovered. Yet looking at Stonehenge, there are mainstream accounts that tell us that this wonderful series of stones was modified, renovated, moved, and changed many times over the intervening years. So what we're looking at today with Stonehenge, how accurately does that reflect the original monument, if you want to call it that? And indeed, there's great debate in terms of the origin of many of these megalithic monuments. Are they actually monuments? Are they the good old-fashioned temples and tombs that our ancestors were informed by the mainstream were just utterly obsessed with 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Or is it something else? It does bear certain alignments with the cosmic calendar or celestial events, But what is it really about? Here's its present location in the United Kingdom, and as stated earlier, this is one of the most well-known megalithic structures in the land, and indeed, Stonehenge is affiliated with the United Kingdom. When you go on a European vacation to the United Kingdom, you go to Stonehenge, especially if you're from the United States. And we recall what Clark W. Griswold did when he went there. When you look at overlays of how Stonehenge was built, it's rather intriguing because remember that megaliths are from a prehistoric time, and Stonehenge is no exception, prehistoric being before recorded history. So again, we're using the implements of science, the scientific method and studies and soil analysis and composition of materials to ascertain exactly how the structure was originally constructed. And supposedly it was originally just a circle and then eventually augmented over time. And who exactly built it? Well, there's some accounts that say that it was ancient Druids, other accounts refer to a Neolithic people that went all across Europe and actually originated in Central Asia. Oddly enough, pointing back to what is today Turkey. Although, strangely, I don't recall reading those theories until after the discovery of a certain megalithic structure that will remain unnamed. Not that we didn't refer to it earlier in this exploration. The stones are well numbered and well ordered, especially with the more modern studies. And yet we referred to the numerous efforts to renovate this particular structure. And yes, Stonehenge has been in the news recently because unfortunately it was vandalized, and any structure, and I'll even say it, even new structures, should not be vandalized. But we have different folklore accounts of the construction of Stonehenge, such as Merlin actually using magic to transport the stones from Ireland to the United Kingdom. There's also the matter of what's the actual composition of these stones. Are they what we're told they are, or are they a completely different composition? Here we can see the alleged movement of Neolithic peoples, again before recorded history, so we're reliant on science, DNA studies, and archaeological digs to determine exactly where these people came from and how they ended up in the United Kingdom at that time, or England or Britain, or whatever ancient name you want to refer to it as. And here we see one of the earliest pictures, or at least one of the artistic renderings of what Stonehenge looked like, depicting the sarsen stones and blue stones that make up this incredible stone circle. We're informed that these stones are naturally occurring around Britain today, whether it's in Wales or the immediate area, and moving them to Salisbury Plain, while it may have been a difficult chore, was certainly not impossible. What's intriguing to me, though, is that we do have these older images, these artistic renderings of Stonehenge, and we can't help but notice how it seems to appear a little different than what we have in pictures. And again, we referred to the fact that Stonehenge is something that's been renovated, or perhaps a better term would be meddled with over time. And indeed, there are many other alternative researchers, and I'll highlight one, Howdy Mikowski, who stated that when he was there, he did not feel the natural energy that one tends to feel when they're at a site such as this. And I've been there myself a long time ago, and I will certainly corroborate Howdy's account. But again, that's just our accounts. You could go there yourself, and maybe you will still feel some natural energy there. Or maybe for you, it'll just be like walking amongst stones, and your best memory will be Clark Griswold knocking them over accidentally with his car in National Lampoon's European Vacation. Here we have an image of the stones being allegedly renovated and placed back into position. So what's the true account behind Stonehenge? And are there still stones that may be present on site that are the original stones? Or have they been changed? Has the composition of what's actually sitting there been changed as well? Are they encased in more modern concrete? Or do we even have the original stones on site? Given the fact that we actually have images and accounts of many of the older stones being moved, what's really going on there? And why do we have people who say that they don't feel the same energy signature they do, and granted that's an internal perception, that they do in other standing stone locations that do seem to be a little bit more legitimate and don't have a mainstream account of being renovated numerous times over the years? Salisbury Plain supposedly represents the Neolithic culture's desire to put up such a monument that recognized the calendar at the time. But what was really going on? What is the true account with construction of this, and why is it that this is the most well-known megalithic site in the land? When you look at the older images, you'll see that they appear very different than what we had in the distant past with the paintings. Now, we could simply say that's, once again, artistic license. You can't prove that what the artist is actually painting or drawing or whatever other method they use to compose their work of art, that they were being completely accurate. but you can actually see different images, whether it's from a plane in the distant past, that show that there's many different features of Stonehenge, that the layout seems to have changed quite immeasurably. And is that just merely a matter of different perceptions, or is that reflecting the reality, the way that this particular megalithic structure changed over time? You can go there to this day and you can examine the stones relatively up close. Well, at least you could. And you can get an idea of what their exact composition is. But does it reflect the origin? Does it reflect the way they were originally laid out by whatever this Neolithic culture was? Or if you go off the folklore, Druids. And you can certainly see no shortage of diagrams for how these stones were fixed together. Or is that really how they were originally constructed? Or is that just something to give us the idea of how they may have been constructed? Because none of us are certainly going to go out there and disassemble these stones and see how they're actually put together. It is still a dramatic sight, and visually it's quite intriguing. It's also unique to consider how it lines up with sunrise and the celestial calendar. But again, this is something that you have to ask questions on concerning what's the relevance of Stonehenge and why is all of our attention seemingly directed to it? Because there's many megalithic sites across the land. Now, of course, we talk about the most recently discovered one in Turkey from the 1990s that we're supposed to accept was never known about before, and all the time of intervening cultures and all the attempts of what they considered archaeologists at the time, or the antiquarians. And so, think about this if you ever go to Stonehenge. Consider what it's really like there with the energy signature, or what you feel when you're actually on the land. Consider the account of the stones and do your own research to see how many times in the historical account these particular stones have been modified. Were they renovated? Were they restored? Were they pulled out of their original position? Were they restored to different positions? These are all important considerations. And now let's move on to our next megalithic structure as we go to Baalbek. Baalbek has quite a history to it, and we're going to those Greco-Roman or Roman-Greco ruins once again. Now, granted, this isn't Baalbek, but it's just to give the point that these kind of ruins are all over the land. Indeed, we might recall when we did the Iowa exploration in Des Moines, we saw that the Des Moines capital looked rather Roman. Here's the location of Baalbek in eastern Lebanon off the Syrian border, and it's about 40 miles from the capital of Beirut. Interesting enough, this city has had a history which has included many different empires or civilizations being present, from Alexander the Great to the Romans. And indeed, the most dramatic ruins there tend to be the Temple of Jupiter built by the Romans, although we could make an argument that all the other ruins there could constitute some significant indications of a previous civilization. They even go so far as to tell us that there are ruins from all these different civilizations, but none so dramatic as the Temple of Jupiter. And here, as we look at some of these early images, we'll see these supposed megaliths, although they also call them monoliths as well. No, not the monolith from 2001, but the monolith that makes up the central stones of the primary temple of Jupiter. When you look around at many of these images, though, you get the impression that these stones have been there for quite some time, and yet when you look at different reliefs, you'll see familiar symbols, such as this one from the Temple of Jupiter. Where have we seen that symbol before, or perhaps I should say that pattern? Ah, yes, in the Iowa State Capitol in Des Moines. Where else? Because there's only 1,800 years or more that officially separate these structures, so naturally they'd have the exact same symbols and patterns on them. I guess the architect of the Iowa State Capitol, who coincidentally passed away right after designing it, was inspired by Rome, even though he never went there. The Temple of Jupiter is incredibly colossal and is the largest temple dedicated to Jupiter ever built by Rome. Official history tells us, though, that they constructed this temple around 16 BC. Of course, there's conflicting accounts that say it might have been constructed in 100 AD or whatever calendar we're going off of today. Just a slight discrepancy. I mean, we're not talking over 500 years, but just a couple hundred years in this particular case. Whatever the situation, we're to believe that the Romans decided to build the largest temple to Jupiter, not in Rome, their primary chief deity, but in a colony that they had recently acquired control of, because that, of course, makes total sense. In any event, there are very dramatic ruins to be viewed in Baalbek, and these catch our attention, especially with the Temple of Jupiter, given the amount of effort and the construction detail that went into it. Now, of course, the mainstream does admit that they don't exactly know, neither do archaeologists, how this incredible temple was constructed. Now, they have many different theories. They state that perhaps the Romans built a special crane, and that's how they were able to put these blocks, or some of these large stones, monoliths as they call them, in place, some weighing as much as 800 tons. Although, again, you really have to wonder how exactly they knew exactly what they weighed. I mean, obviously it was a guess, but it's not like you put a stone like that on a scale, so it's an estimate. But of course, we have technology that can tell us exactly how much these stones weigh. This is a very dramatic and incredible layout for something that was just a temple. Although, are we really just looking at a temple, or is this something else? I'll be the first to admit that I have absolutely no idea how they managed to put these stones in place, and supposedly this is a mosque, although this doesn't exactly look like any mosque that I've seen, but we can certainly see that construction styles inspire others, or we can go back to that old cultural argument about different cultures being influenced by the others and which one was first. I mean, we're certainly not going to suggest that this was all one unified civilization. But looking at the remnants or the ruins, or however you want to phrase these very dramatic structures that still stand vicinity Baalbek to this day, you have to ask yourself, how exactly was this done? And this is a question that I will give the mainstream credit for, because they haven't decided to jump to conclusions on it. They have theories for how the blocks were moved, and we'll look at some of the most dramatic blocks here in a moment. But even the rest of these structures that still stand are very dramatic. And yet, as we stated earlier, they still remind us of other structures that would come over 1,800 years later. Of course, the official explanation is going to be that once again it was yet another revival, it was yet another renaissance to decide to employ building techniques and styles that were used by the Romans, because everybody wanted to be like the Romans, especially the United States, and especially people in Iowa after the Civil War, because, why wouldn't you want to be like the Romans? You look, though, at these ruins and you get the impression of some sort of great disaster, and here we even have the intact monoliths, as they call them. Now, this is supposedly the stone of the pregnant woman. I don't exactly know where they got that term from, but this is the largest monolith that's still on the site. Now, they tell us that the quarry is nearby the Temple of Jupiter, and they didn't really have to move this that far. Now, never mind how difficult cutting this would have been, but we're not even going to address that question, because we can assume that if they moved it, they must have known how to cut it. Otherwise, why would they cut it, right? We don't need to hypothesize or speculate on what the cutting method was. And it's always interesting to me how it seems that many people, when they're trying to determine exactly how these large stones were moved, and here we're looking at the base monoliths that weigh 900 tons in the Temple of Jupiter, how exactly were they cut or were they moved? Well, we tend to concern ourselves with how they were moved, and we feel that if we can answer that question, how they were moved, then we don't need to concern ourselves with how they were cut. When they had forced labor, they could really do anything. And here in this particular image, you can see where these 900-ton stones were, the trilithon stones. And then you have the 400-ton beveled blocks that make up the base. Just imagine that, cutting those blocks and then moving them. How easy would that have been? And we look at how modern technology struggles to move anything that's 100 to 200 tons. And here you can see it with the trilithon stones, the 900-ton stones. And they shatter all logical explanations and great examples of lost advanced engineering techniques. Now, that's not to state that we don't exactly know how it was done, but we have no idea how it was done. And we simply have theories. Now, who really did this, or who was responsible for this? Was this the Romans? We still ask the question, why would the Romans build the most dramatic and the largest temple to Jupiter, their chief deity, in a location that was so far away from Rome? Well, of course, because they were arrogant and they wanted to show how powerful they were. And yet, oddly enough, you still see stones and similar cuttings that we've seen in other structures, such as the base stones to the Iowa State Capitol and many county courthouses that we've looked at. And here this gives you an idea of the dramatic size of these tremendous blocks, these monoliths, or these megaliths, because now we use the terms interchangeably, to try to describe, to really understand what this Temple of Jupiter was. Now, does this necessarily prove anything? Is it impossible that a previous civilization could have done this? The answer is no, somebody did this. But when we look at these impressive stones and we see them in their original quarry, we do have to ask the question, how were they cut? Why were they cut? How were they moved? And why were they moved? Was it really just to build an amazing temple? Or was there some other purpose behind the structure? And the final question is, how old is this structure? Of course, we're led to believe that it's closing on 2,000 years old, but is that really the answer? Is it already over 2,000 years old? I mean, we can date the rocks, but another interesting question is, are these actually natural occurring blocks, or is there something else that went into the design of them? Now, that might sound like it's a little far-fetched, a little speculative, but when we look at how well formed and how detailed many of these reliefs are, these are the kind of questions that we have to ask. Now, of course, with many of the temples or palaces in the United States that we've explored, virtually any state capital that was constructed before 1920, we have to try to contrive exactly how these massive blocks were moved. And there are some theories that we're going to look at. The mainstream, or at least individuals who represent the mainstream, do have a variety of theories that supposedly tell us exactly how they moved these very large blocks. And it's quite interesting to consider that this is the official explanation, or at least one of the official theories. And if we can come up with a theory, then perhaps we can explain how the blocks were moved into place. Remember, we do not need to concern ourselves with how they were cut, and yes, my sarcasm meter is maxed out right now, because if we could move them, certainly we could cut them. And then you might see this interesting apparatus here, a series of wheels that were all tied up with a series of pulleys, and that's how these massive 900-ton stones were slid. And we'll look at the exact article and the suppositions of an individual who claims to know exactly how these stones were moved. And they state that because they moved the Thunderstone at St. Petersburg, and you might recall when we explored that in St. Petersburg, Russia, that was an even larger stone. Although, oddly enough, the documentation behind that particular stone is, well, at best quite questionable. And indeed, was there some other more advanced technique to moving this, if in fact they did? Now you might notice that in this particular painting we have this Thunderstone being moved, and it doesn't seem to reflect the techniques that we saw, but we do see in the painting that it's being moved by human power. Of course it would be, because you can be more precise with human power. It's not feasible to have a bunch of oxen out there to move it through animal means. So what's really the answer behind this, whether it's the Thunderstone or the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek? How exactly was this done? As I've stated, I don't know. And for the last portion of our exploration, we're going to look at the wondrous megaliths of Yangshan Quarry in China. And you can look up the location at your leisure, but here we have the very largest megaliths ever quarried. At least this is what the mainstream tells us, and in my travels and my research, this is certainly the largest megaliths I've ever heard about. And because we have a very straight line, we have to acknowledge the fact that these were cut. Because as Tom Hardy, Logan Marshall Green told us in Prometheus, God does not build in straight lines, and he doesn't cut in straight lines either, or whatever God is supposed to be in that particular movie. Regardless, this was supposed to be a monument constructed during the Ming Dynasty, and if you're familiar with Chinese history, you'll find that many things are attributed to the Ming Dynasty, much as many things are attributed to Rome in Europe. And here to give you a sense of scale, we have a couple of people that are actually walking amongst these tremendous megaliths. And depending which particular portion of this quarried site we're talking about for this monument, these stones weigh anywhere from 6,000 to almost 9,000, up to 16,000 tons, depending on which part of this tremendous monument we are referring to. So just take that into consideration. 6,000 tons, 9,000 tons, or 16,000 tons. Imagine what it would take to have actually cut these. Now, of course, we say quarried, but how exactly were these even cut away from the existing stone? How much effort did it really take? What were the processes that were actually involved? And here we can see on the base stone, which allegedly weighs up to 16,000 tons, but who knows for sure, it's an estimate. To move that, according to Dr. Heiser, you just need to get your wheels on the side of it, and then you can just pull it wherever you need it, because there's no limit in terms of moving objects. You just build wheels on the side of it. Or if you're going to slide it into place, all you need to do is build your system of pulleys and wheels, in this case 200 wheels, and then you get 200 Conans out there to push each one of them with its elaborate system of pulleys, and then you could slide this 16,000 ton megalith into place. It's elementary. Or maybe there's some means behind this we can't begin to imagine. Just imagine this time frame from what we're told and what our understanding of history is. Our mainstream understanding of history, some individuals actually cutting this tremendous megalith, this monolith, this very large stone of 16,000 tons
from the surrounding rock. What kind of effort would this have taken? And then on the other rocks, we can see other construction methods and other fine detailing that actually went into it. How exactly did they cut it? Was it just with a hammer and chisel and a lot of effort? Once again, now whether we want to say it's forced labor or it was simply directed labor or the fine discipline of that particular society, at least as we understand it in history, this is quite a substantial site. And it's just unbelievable to imagine moving megaliths of this particular size. Yet somebody attempted to do it. Somebody cut these. Or could these have been remnants of something else that we can't even begin to imagine? And indeed, the closer that you look at a lot of these sites, you can see fine detailing. And we've seen this kind of detailing in other interesting sites that we've looked at in other explorations. So what's all this really pointing to with the megaliths? Are the megaliths exactly what we think they are? That they're just natural stones that are out there? Or did they have some other function or purpose that we can't even begin to imagine? Just think of some sort of technological device that was this large that was actually made of this material. Or we just simply accept that civilizations in the past, whether it was the Romans or the Chinese or the Ming Dynasty or whatever particular name we have for the civilization, empire, or ruler that was around at the time in the particular area in the land that they were at, that all they had to do with their resources was direct the construction of tremendous megalithic structures, that they managed to innovate ways to move these tremendous structures. And once again, we won't even think about the cutting of the structures, because if we can conceptualize moving them, then obviously they could cut them. And here you can see how they label the different monument head, the monument body, and the monument base. The monument base is the one that's stated to weigh 16,000 tons. So what was really the purpose behind all this? Was this to simply construct a monument? How much effort really went into this if this was all with labor? And wouldn't labor be spent in some other pursuit, doing something else? We're constantly told of all the revolts and internal and external threats that all these civilizations faced. And yet somehow they had the resources, they had the time to construct these tremendous megalithic structures, these monuments, these temples, these tombs. That's what we're supposed to believe, and that's what the mainstream will tell us. Although, once again, how this is actually done, well, maybe we should ask Dr. Heiser, and he'll just simply say, there's an account that was translated through 3 different languages and several different civilizations that'll tell us exactly how it was done. And it's a story, and you should just believe it. But what do you think? What's really the purpose behind these megaliths, and how are they done? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.